I'm going to call this lecture Empiricism Part 1. And our focus today will be on John Locke's empiricism. And by the way, one of the things that we will have to begin with, and I'm going to go into a little bit more detail than the text does, is we'll discuss his critique of Cartesian rationalism. And then we'll also talk about the basic concepts, and we'll talk about some of the consequences of taking Locke's empiricism seriously. Now, folks, many of you have probably heard of the philosopher John Locke in another context. As a matter of fact, many of his basic ideas about perception were originally foundational to a lot of our psychological assumptions about what goes on in the mind. But the main area where John Locke was of great historic significance is upon what other discipline? Any takers?
Well, wasn't it like the Declaration of Independence?
Yeah, political science. As a matter of fact, most of Locke's conception of what human beings are and what good government is, was taken by Thomas Jefferson and the framers. So many of the ideas that we hold near and dear politically are essentially Lockean in origin. So you really can't overestimate the value, the importance of John Locke, even if you've never heard the guy's name before. It's a name you perhaps should have heard before. By the way, his definition of work is also sort of embedded in our way of thinking. He defines work as that activity by which we annex pieces of nature to our person. And that is what defines for him property. Many Americans hold Locke's account of property to be fundamental. The purpose of government, according to many of my libertarian friends, is simply to provide protection of property. Nothing else. Nothing more, nothing else.
And that's what he thinks?
Yeah. Although he might say it would be a little bit more, but that's fundamental. Fundamental to John Locke is that the main function of government is the protection of private property. Now, of course, the way that that's been taken out of context in the American political sphere isn't necessarily in the spirit of John Locke, I will admit. Because John Locke would likely have problems with some of the ways that we have protected the powerful. And here's why. He says we have a right to annex things to ourselves through our labor, as long as we leave enough in common for others. And that's that principle, as long as we leave enough in common for others. There are many of our rich and powerful who would not hold that part of Locke's principles, because they would grab all of they can, regardless of what it means to whom. Not just their fellow Americans, but to the rest of humanity. In other words, Locke argued for a kind of restraint that many of our rich and powerful argue vehemently against. Good question, by the way. Yeah. Now, let's get started. I think this one might have seen better days too. Let me see if any of these have not had. What is the main claim of empiricism? That all knowledge, that is anything that is worthy of being called knowledge, must have originated where? And by the way, if you ever read a copy of John Locke, his treatise concerning the human understanding, you will even see the word experience in what?
Wow.
Didn't Locke write Leviathan, or is that?
That was Hobbes.
Hobbes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you read a copy of John Locke, every version of mine that I have of John Locke's treatise concerning the human understanding, the word experience is emphasized in all caps. He wanted to make that nice and sparkling clear. All knowledge originates in sensory experience. Every single idea in your mind had to have had its origins in sensory experience. Now this is part of the account of Locke that I think is important to emphasize, because the text doesn't quite go into enough detail. But his manner of challenging Cartesian rationalism is to what I like to call go straight after his jugular. That's a metaphor, not literal. What he does is he goes after the foundation of Cartesian rationalism. And just to give you guys a hint, the foundation of Cartesian rationalism starts with an I. He will challenge the Cartesian concept of innate ideas. Remember, Descartes said that there are certain ideas that are in the mind and are self-evident through the clear light of reason alone. It is these ideas that a foundation of knowledge can be built upon. Now, what Locke is going to say is there are contra Descartes, there are no such things as innate ideas. He doesn't leave it at that, because he has to provide a what?
Evidence.
Yeah, he's got to provide an argument. He's got to provide evidence. Now here's how he does it. He will take several ideas that Descartes takes to be innate. And I'll give you two that Descartes does and another that others take to be innate. Here are three ideas that have oftentimes been assumed to be innate ideas. Remember, Descartes contends that the I, or the self, is an innate idea, and it's the entire foundation of his ability to attain knowledge. What was another innate idea according to Descartes? Three-letter word? God, thank you. Descartes will also argue that God is an innate idea, and you'll recall he used that peculiar argument called the Ontological Argument. Now there's a third innate idea that he critiques, but it is not one that is fundamental to Descartes. There are many people at the time of John Locke's writing who believed in this. They believed that every single person has embedded within them an innate moral sense. And by the way, I imagine you know a few people who believe this, even if they haven't used that word. If you've ever heard someone say, but everyone knows that stealing is immoral, or everyone knows that murder is immoral, everyone knows that. Well, guess what? I'm with Locke on this one. Not everyone knows that murder is immoral. As a matter of fact, you have to understand what murder is before you could have that idea. Now, John Locke's argument is simple and elegant. What he contends is that if these ideas were truly innate, what should we expect about them? Who should have them? If these ideas were innate, absolutely every person who has ever lived on the face of this planet ought to have had these ideas embedded in their minds before they were born, as Descartes claims. But he says this is obviously not the case. And he gives three classes of people as an example. Idiots, infants in arms, and savages. and elegant. He says, if these ideas were innate, then every single person who's ever walked the face of the earth should have had them. And they should have had them from the second they were born. He says, but this is obviously not the case. Because idiots, and by the way, that is his politically incorrect word for what people? The mentally challenged. He says, idiots don't have any of these three ideas. Infants in arms. When he's talking about infants in arms, he's not talking about infants with handguns. It's not like a Chucky movie or something like this. He's talking about, I guess what amusement parks they call handhelds. Is that the phrase for them? No handheld infants, is that it? Yeah, infants in arms are handhelds. Infants don't have any of these ideas. And of course, when he's talking about savages, by the way, Locke was kind of progressive for his time, by the way. However, he still held what European, Eurocentric assumption? Yeah.
That Europe was the center of all civilization and everything the Europeans did was perfect and in the eyes of and blessed by God.
Yeah, and anybody who was not basically a Caucasian male was inherently inferior. And of course, this justified all kinds of things. This is part of how imperialism was justified. Yeah, they're not people anyway, and besides, we're bringing them Christendom. It's what
we're bringing law and order to this savage land.
Yeah, as if
shooting everyone.
Yeah, as if they didn't already have their own law and order. Well, they also had it's not lost on most of you people. But what they had that the Europeans wanted were resources. What they had that the Europeans wanted were natural resources. You don't think the British would have been in Burma if it weren't for things like lumber and rubber? What reason would they have had to be there? But of course, this is something that is not obvious. It's totally obvious, but it's not obvious until what? Yeah, well, I say until you're actually shown it. When it's shoved in front of your face, you go, oh, well, of course. Why would we spend all of these resources to send armies and navies somewhere if it weren't in some sense in our, I'll use the phrase, if it weren't somehow in our interests? But anyway, I don't want to belabor that point too much now. We'll have time for that when we discuss Karl Marx. And that's going to be a little bit later on. But anyway, what John Locke says is, if these ideas were innate, then all of these groups should also have them. But they don't. Now he says, what's more? And I'll read this in a minute. Another caveat to his argument is this. He says, even if there were universal assent is another word for universal agreement. He says, even if every single person on the face of the earth agreed on the same moral rules, it would not prove that morality was innate. Even if every person on the face of the globe believed in God, but notice, in order for it to count as an innate idea anyway, we should have what kind of a concept of God?
The same concept.
Yeah, an identical concept of God, which we don't. He says, even if everybody on the face of the globe had a concept of God and an identical concept of God, it still wouldn't prove the idea of God was innate. Because social learning models can actually more simply account for why people would agree. Now, there's a reason why most Americans have a generally similar idea of God. And this is because many Americans were brought up with the same religion or had it forced down their throats in one way or another. Now I'm going to play John Locke's advocate here a little bit more. I certainly don't have an innate idea of God. As a matter of fact, where did I get my innate idea, or where did I get my idea of God? Sorry, I misspoke. It was taught to me at a young age by my fire and brimstone Christian parents. They gave me their concept of God. And by the way, it wasn't Buddy Christ. You know, that's sort of what that was, that movie with George Carlin. But yeah, it was definitely not Buddy Christ. The God I was taught about was the angry, Old Testament wrathful God. Was it raining fire in the sky on Sodom and Gomorrah, that kind of thing. A big man in the clouds with a bad temper. That was my idea of God. But I'm exaggerating a little bit here. I do have certain characteristics of God in my mind too. I imagine God's voice, and this tells you my age, by the way. Every time I say this to young people now, they say Morgan Freeman. I'm like, I didn't see that movie. I said, but I've heard of it. If my generation hears the voice of God ringing in their head, take a guess whose voice it is.
Charlton Heston?
Yeah, he's got it right. Charlton Heston. Because in the iconic film, The Ten Commandments, not only did he play Moses, but he also did the voiceover for God. So yeah, if I imagine God's voice, now you'll notice this isn't an innate idea. I saw the movie. I've heard Charlton Heston. I connected Charlton Heston with my idea of the voice of God via what? Via experience. And I'm going to keep belaboring more of these points more and more. Keep in mind that even people who call themselves Christian don't have identical concepts of God either. My wife's aunt's side of the family, they have a very fire and brimstone Old Testament God, who hates gays and things of that nature, and wants to rain his righteous judgment on the world. Whereas I have other Christian friends, most of them Catholic, I admit, who are a little more into God's agapic and forgiving love. Now those are two very different strains of Christians. And the way they talk about God and things couldn't be as different. But nonetheless, they have ideas of God. But they're not what? Yeah, they don't seem to be the same God at all to me. Descartes took the idea of the I to be fundamental. Someone speaking in Locke's favor would likely say, the infant in arms has no idea about the self. As a matter of fact, the child doesn't have any ideas in its mind at all. The child does have perceptions. The child does have the ability to feel things like pleasure and pain. But those are not ideas. Remember what ideas are, folks. Ideas are concepts in the mind. And according to the empiricist model, you cannot have concepts unless you first have what? Starts with a P. Yeah. Yeah, if you haven't had perceptions, there will be no concepts. Perceptions come first, or percepts come first. And then we derive our ideas about things from our percepts. Where does a child get his idea of a dog? Well, the child is shown dogs, and then eventually the child comes to the conclusion that even though these two beasts might look radically different from one another, they fall under the concept dog. And by the way, depending on the child, he or she with insufficient experience might mistake something that's not a dog for a dog. And vice versa. Or I'll give you an easy example. If you have the idea of a fish, of course, the first time you see a dolphin, the small child might think, fish, fish. No, that's not a fish, that's a mammal. And of course, that leads to having to explain the concept of a mammal to the child. But it's understandable why the child would induce that a dolphin is also a fish. Because why? Lives in the water, has a lot of the attributes, fins and flippers and things of this nature. Has a lot of the same characteristics. But the child would have been wrong. The child gets the idea of a fish through experience. The same way the child gets the idea of a square, a circle, or a triangle, or the number 2. Even though the idea 2 is a clear and distinct concept, an empiricist would say, you can't have an idea of it until you experience it or learn it. The mind, and here we go. What is the mind at birth according to Locke? This is a famous line. The mind at birth is as a tabula rasa, a blank or empty slate devoid of characters. If you read on in John Locke, he uses another colorful metaphor. Well, it's not a colorful metaphor, but he has another metaphor. Tabula rasa literally means a blank or empty slate. He also elsewhere refers to it as being like an empty pantry. I have to admit, I like the pantry metaphor a little bit better, because I like pantries. You know, you go in, you're looking for some soup or whatever. And of course, at birth, what's in the pantry, according to this account? Nothing is in the pantry. However, as the person has experiences, that pantry or empty slate starts to get filled with ideas, albeit imperfect ideas. Now, a couple more things. He talks about the things that our ideas consist of. And by the way, where do ideas exist? This should have been easy because we've talked about this in the context of Descartes. Ideas exist in minds, ladies and gentlemen. Ideas don't exist out there. What exists out there according to John Locke? John Locke did not entirely disagree with Descartes on everything. As a matter of fact, he contended that minds exist. But what else also exists? He contended that a world exists of material things. And these material things are made of this mysterious substrate that we simply call matter. Now I'm getting ahead just a little bit here. Can we know how matter really is? His answer would be no, we can't. Because we never experience matter directly. We experience it as mediated by our senses. So we never really experience things as they really are. Now, our ideas, according to him, we could not have any ideas unless a world existed for us to experience. So he takes for granted that a material world exists, even though he can't prove that he knows anything absolutely speaking about it. He can know that it is, and he can know that we get data in our senses by experiencing the material world. Now, these ideas that we have in our mind consist of what he called sensations. And by the way,